Fit Youth, welcome to this week's Wednesday night cross training. Glad you could join me tonight. So, if you remember, we're in a lesson series called Man Alive, and we're going to continue that lesson tonight. And the series that we're in right now talks about the doctrinal truth of man. And you can go back if you missed the last couple of cross-training episodes. You can go back and watch those on my Facebook page or on YouTube. So if you hadn't seen those, check them out, because this is it's a trailing series, so this won't make as much sense if you don't watch those too. So if you hadn't seen them, go back and watch those. If you go to YouTube, go to Pleasant Valley Baptist Church, Waycross. Okay, Pleasant Valley Baptist Church, Waycross. If not, go to my Facebook page, Jason Musgrove. It's right under my name. So we're specifically talking about, in the last lesson and this week's lesson, light for a dark world. And the sticky statement for these lessons is stay close to the light. And if you remember, we're talking about, where does suffering come from? Okay, everybody experienced some level of suffering in their life. A lot of people experience a lot of different levels of suffering in their life at different intervals in their lifespan. So where does suffering come from? And where can I find help for that suffering? So as a way of review, we asked a question last time we were together. It said, have you ever tried to accomplish a task in the dark? And we talked about, maybe taking the trash can to the road, and how scary that can be if it's pitch black dark outside and you forgot to take it out to the road before the sun went down, and how that you have to be careful where you walk, or how you move, or you have to watch with your surroundings, because you know what it's like to do in the light. You can see everything around you, so there's nothing to stumble on, because you can move to the right or to the left of that. Or if there's a snake crawling out the bushes, well, at night you wouldn't see that as well as during the day. Well, so how do you know that it's harder to do a task in the dark? Well, it's because you have done things in the light. So we only know darkness because we know light. So someone who has never experienced light doesn't know the difference in light and darkness, only by what others tell them. And if you remember, we read the story of a blind man in the Bible in John chapter 9. And as a matter of fact, let's read that. I've got my Bible.is app ready here. So John chapter 9, verses 1 through 7, and it says, and as he passed by, that's Jesus, he saw a blind man from birth. So this man had been blind from birth, and it says it in the passage here, so we know that everyone around him knew that he had been blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that caused him to be born blind? Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day, that's God the Father, because night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, that's Jesus talking, I am the light of the world. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with his spit. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So he went and washed, and he came back seeing. So how did this man know that he was blind and in darkness? Only because he knew that others around them spoke of things that he could not see. So he only learned of light because of those around him. He knew nothing but darkness. He was blind. And we talked about some assumptions that the disciples made. You saw in the scripture there that the disciples immediately assumed that this man was blind either because this man sinned, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, we'll talk about that in a minute, or that he was blind because of some sin that his parents committed and that they were being punished by him being blind. But let's go back to the question about suffering. Why? So, why did this man have to suffer? And why do we have to suffer at different times in our lives in different ways? Well, we're going to kind of break that down a little bit tonight, and I'm going to give you some examples here. So, where does suffering come from, first of all? Where does suffering come from? Well, number one, suffering can come as a result of circumstances. Okay, nothing but pure circumstance. It's important to understand from the beginning that this had nothing to do with bad luck. Okay, this man was not blind because of bad luck, or it's just the hand that he was dealt. Okay, that's not the case here. We're simply talking about suffering that you have no control over. That's what suffering as a result of circumstance is. Suffering because of something that you had no control over. This man was born blind, okay? How much control did he have over that? None. Zero. Zilch. He had no control over the fact that he was being born blind, but he was born blind. When he made his entrance into this world, his eyes did not function like the eyes of most humans. It wasn't his fault, okay? It wasn't anyone's fault in particular. His eyes simply did not work. But that didn't change the fact that he had to deal with the results of his blindness. It was just a blindness as a result of circumstance. So that's one reason that suffering comes, just simply by pure circumstance. Well, number two, there could be suffering because of sin, okay? The disciples immediately assumed when they met this man that the answer for this suffering was either a result of his own sin or the result of the sin of his parents. They immediately made that assumption. See, they thought they had it all figured out. It was an either-or answer. Either this man had sinned or his parents had sinned. They viewed the suffering as punishment. Well, let's break this suffering as a result of sin down a little bit, because there's several ways that you can suffer as a result of sin. Well, number one is you can suffer as a result of your own sin, okay? So think about this. If you go into Pt2's store down here and you go down one of the aisles and you stick some candy bars in your pocket and a drink in the other pocket, and you walk out and Pt2 saw you do it and he calls the cops on you and you get arrested, well, you're going to suffer as a result of your own sin, okay? If you win the lottery and let's say you win $10,000 on a scratch-off, okay? You win that $10,000, you co-cash it in, and you spend that $10,000 on just whatever, and you, at the end of the spending, you really don't have anything to show for it. You don't have a car, you don't have, nice clothes, you just blew it, okay? So there's going to be some form of suffering after that $10,000 is gone because you just blew it and you don't have anything to show for it. Maybe that wasn't a real good example, but suffering as a result of your own sin. Let's say that you have a girlfriend and you've been dating for 2 years, or you have a boyfriend, 2 years, the love of your life. You love this person with everything in you. You've got plans that you're going to get married and you're going to have a family someday. Y'all were just always together. Um, but one night, somebody texts you, and one text leads to another, and before you know it, you wind up talking about things with that person, or maybe even going over to visit them, and you do something that results in you and your boyfriend, or you and your girlfriend breaking up. Okay? So basically, you cheated on them. Okay? So you're going to suffer as the result of your sin in that circumstance, because she or he is going to break up with you. They're never going to trust you again. The love of your life wants nothing to do with you anymore. They're done. They've moved on and they're dating, and you're still in love with them. You don't care nothing about that person you cheated with. You're going to suffer as the result of your sin. Okay? So we see in many, many situations, when you look at people who are on illegal drugs, and they spend all their money on that, and they wind up being an addict, and they lose everything they have, and sometimes they wind up homeless, or sometimes they move to a life of crime to support their habit of illegal drugs. Well, that person suffers as a result of their own sin. So we see that, number one, suffering as a result of sin of your own. But number two, we can suffer because of the sin of others. Okay, it doesn't always have to be something that we did that causes us to suffer. We can suffer because of the sin of others. Second part of our of the disciples' question was spoke of suffering for the man as a result of his parents' sin. The truth is, the sin of his parents can actually impact the life of a child. Okay? Think about that. The sin of parents can cause their children to suffer. That is a possibility. Babies are born all the time with horrible handicaps as a result of a mother who used drugs or alcohol during her pregnancy. It happens all the time. But most likely the disciples were thinking about maybe that there was one specific sin that these parents took part in that resulted in their child being born blind. Their question seems to hint at the idea of punishment for some sin that they committed. In other words, what terrible sin did the parents do for them to deserve a son who is blind? Because the blindness not only affected the man, but it also affected his family. Well, number three, what about suffering because of sin in general? Okay, suffering can happen simply because we live in a sinful world. Okay, we talked about that a couple of lessons ago, how that sin entered the world as a result of Adam and Eve's sin, and death entered the world, and aging, and suffering entered the world as a result of Adam and Eve's sin. But before that, everything was perfect. The world was perfect. Adam and Eve's life was perfect. But sin caused that to change. So, the process of death and suffering actually started at the time of Adam and Eve's sin. And that has caused us to live in the world that we live in today. And the world that we live in today, in general, people suffer because of the sinful world that we live in. So there can be all sorts of circumstances that we can find ourselves in simply because this is a sinful world that we live in. When it comes to suffering as a result of sin, no matter where it came from, it still hurts, right? No matter what the reason for the suffering is, it still hurts. But there's another truth to consider when it comes to suffering. Maybe your suffering has a higher purpose. Did you ever think about that? Now, I know that that's difficult to think of, especially when you're going through some suffering that's very, very rough on you. Okay? Very, very hard to deal with. It's hard to think, and it's hard to accept sometimes that our suffering could be the result of a higher purpose. Let's talk about suffering for a higher purpose. When Jesus answered the question of the disciples, he revealed a truth about suffering that the disciples never even considered. Many times, it's a truth that we tend to forget as well. Maybe something that we've never even thought of. Jesus viewed this man's suffering from a higher vantage point, God's vantage point. He saw the truth about this man's blindness. See, it was a result of the blind man's sin. How could he have sinned before he was born? Because he was blind from birth, remember? That was a silly thing to assume, that the man was blind as a result of his own sin. But it was also wrong to assume that it was as a result of the sin of the parents, see? What was the reason that the man was born blind? Well, let's go back and let's read verse 3 again in John chapter 9. And let's see what Jesus said. Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned, nor his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him." He wasn't blind as the result of any bad luck or any sin of his or any sin of his parents. He certainly wasn't blind as a result of his own sin because he wasn't born. He was blind because in his blindness, God would get glory. Now that's hard to accept when you're going through something tough, through a tough situation of suffering. It's very hard to think of. But as your faith grows, you can see this more and more. I know I've seen this in my life. Jesus shared a truth about this man that was astounding. Long before this man would ever be born, and certainly long before this man ever saw the light of day, because he did, Jesus healed him, God had a plan to use this man's blindness for his glory. There was a purpose for his blindness. His blindness was going to be used to put the power of God on display and teach a valuable lesson about suffering. Think about the impact that this man's blindness has had on the world. Almost 2,000 years after this man was alive, we're talking about his story today. And his blindness was the reason that we're talking about him today. Now, 2,000 years from now, no one may ever know who Jason Musgrove is. No one may ever know who you are. It's possible, but not probable. No one may ever know that you and I ever existed. But this man is remembered because of his blindness, because of his suffering. What Jesus did next spoke to his compassion, a compassion not only for the suffering of this man specifically, but for the suffering that sin in general has brought to the world. Jesus reminds him that he is the light of the world, and the light had come to dispel the darkness of a different kind. So after this, Jesus spit on the ground, and he made clay with his spit, and he put it on the eyes of the blind man. Now this may sound a little gross, and to the people around this blind man, they were probably like, "Are you kidding me? He's putting slobber and dirt on the man's eyes? Gross." But I can tell you that I've experienced blindness personally, and I think if I was blind and some man that had the power of healing that I've never met before wanted to try putting his slobber and some dirt on my eyes, I might just give him the chance to be able to see. So he spit on the ground, he made mud with the clay, and he put it on his eyes. And he told him to go wash off the clay. And when he did, the man received his sight. This man's suffering allowed him to know the grace of God in a personal way. And it not only showed God's grace to this man, but all of those around him. So it all worked out for the blind man. But that doesn't change our suffering for today, right? That's a great story. But when I go through suffering, how does this help me? How can I? Okay, God showed his grace on that man. How can God show his grace on me? And how can God use this terrible situation that I'm in to change my life? If you're suffering, you might be wondering, where is my help? And that's what we're going to talk about next week. Where can I find help for my suffering? Okay, 2,000 years ago, a blind man was healed. Okay, but what about my suffering right now? The suffering that I'm going through. Where can I find help for this? How can I find help for this? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about next Wednesday night, so you don't want to forget to tune in to that. I'll remind you, like I normally do, on Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat that it's up there. If you have any questions about this lesson, or if you'd like for me to pray for you for any kind of bad situation that you're going through right now, and you need help, you need prayer, you need someone with some encouraging words, please send me or Miss Rebecca a text or a Snapchat and let us know how we can be praying for you. Let us know in what way we can encourage you, and we will do just that because we love you and we want to see you prosper. We want to see God's grace on your life just like it was on this man in the story. So thank y'all for joining me. I love you, and we'll see you next week when we finish up this particular lesson. Thank you.